I want to thank, of course, Michele and Emilio for having me and for setting up such a nice venue to discuss Gramsci's ideas in the interpretation of the past. I really believe that these are needed more than ever in the times we live in. As the paper of Anton and Jake just shown, some of us, all of us, do need to train today even more, even harder to critically review pasts that have been easily archived as accepted and as definitive truths. Today, I will provide a critical reading of Martin Millet's The Romanization of Britain, an essay on archaeological interpretation, through the filter of Gramsci's theories of elites and subalterns in particular. So, why to reread The Romanization of Britain 30 years on? It was published in 1990. There are at least two reasons. The first one, it's a very simple one, it's its age. In 1990, Britain and the world were very different places. For instance, some of today's most popular cultural references did not exist at all. For instance, Ron Atkinson had just made his TV debut as Mr. Bean. Ayatollah Khamenei issued his fatwa against Salman Rushdie's satanic verses. And then England's summer dreams of glory in Italy were crushed by West Germany. We'll see how it goes this year. And we didn't even know how high the biggest sports icon of all time could fly. And as we saw yesterday in Jeremy Patterson's intervention speech, we saw him yesterday in the close of the Tribunus Plebis. We did not know how much this man was really worth. Now we know. I have a feeling that I like thinking that the eyes wide open by Ron Atkinson in the background are kind of made by him watching in the future a few years on and seeing him as a president of the US. So what this time lapse should help us to do is to probably assess if in 30 years Millet's book has exhausted its potential or can still provide insightful questions on Roman Britain. That's what I will try to show. The second reason to take care of going back to this book is probably the fact that it is located at a theoretical crossroad, we can say, between the end of one century dominant archaeological paradigm and historical paradigm, Romanization, and another one that had just risen, which is the post-colonial critique of Romanization. In Andrew Gardner's words, the Romanization of Britain represents, quote, the most sophisticated expression of Romanization because it shifts attention to the native side of the Romanization equation, end of quote. So this makes of it at once the final and more refined product of a convinced application of a binary Romanization model to ancient Roman Republic and Empire, and at the same time, the emergent post-colonial critiques to previous binary interpretive frameworks. I have uploaded the whole text in a word cloud generator, which, as most of you know, represents in bigger size the most recurrent words used in a text. And we can see the expected bigger size of words like Rome, Roman, and Britain, of course. Then we see words like social, economic, material that are hinting us about the study that the author of the book provides. And then there is a group of smaller words, but which are crucial ones if we are going to filter the Romanization of Britain through Gramsci's theoretical paradigms, like personal, competitive, elite, of course. We will see how dominant it is, but also relationships, prestige, and display. So the focus of the Romanization of Britain is on the methodological effort to show how power and consent find shape in material remains of the past, trying particularly to highlight the structural role given to local elites in the application and maintainment of hegemony, but also on the effects from a certain point on, the 1st century AD in particular, that their growing individualism had on subalterns. So as a structure, the Romanization of Britain provides a chronological analysis of the phenomenon by looking at the differences in material evidence between the later pre-Roman Iron Age and full Roman and late imperial period Britain, as its task is that of testing if the material change was brought about at the official time of annexation, or as the previous paper was showing brilliantly, even before. So to start with, it is paramount to ask ourselves one question that most of us have felt very comfortable with in the last decades. What is Romanization again? Answers usually range, as we know, from a acculturation paradigm to a process of civilization of barbarians, a stronger approach. But a first critique moved to Romanization, on which most of us probably agree, is that it retrieves a binary and simplistic version of history. But what we probably should try to understand is what every single book and discourse using this word mean for the word Romanization. So what is it meant in the Romanization of Britain? The book goes like this, quote, Romanization as a process of dialectical change rather than the influence of a pure culture upon others. Roman culture interacted with native cultures to produce the synthesis that we call Romanized, end of quote, which to me sounds quite post-colonial. Surprisingly, the first times I read the book, I found something so present in a theory that tends to critique such an approach. So this definition rejects cultural purity, an attitude that will shortly be a pillar of post-colonialism. Nevertheless, if refusal of cultural purity was applied strongly to dominating culture, for example, Rome, by post-colonial scholars, we are reminded that some of them tended to forget. For example, Alicia Jimenez, studying Hispania Bética, tells us that the dominated culture can be essentialized too, as nativist ideas only reproduce a European fantasy about European origins through the image of a lost pure culture, which is the culture of the other, as Anton was showing earlier. Another criticism moved to Romanization as a general paradigm is that of being too elite-oriented. In the words of Mike McCarthy, though it seems to be a prerogative of most books on the Roman Britain to, quote, present a VIP version of history because they focus on conquest and elites, end quote. Indeed, many works of synthesis on Roman Britain rely strongly on descriptive accounts of material culture and contexts related to military annexation and conquest. For example, public buildings, monuments graved with inscriptions, or with unmistakably high status grave goods, expensive and decorated country houses, mosaics, statues, good-looking finds in general. So these tend to create, indeed, an elitist account of history, which needs a critical assessment. Of course, this is not a problem that concerns Roman Britain and studies of Roman Britain only. It concerns archaeology and history in general. Even when non-elite artifacts are published, in fact, they are less effective than their counterparts. This is what I find generally. First of all, because they are outnumbered by elite-related artifacts. And second, because I genuinely think we are missing a consistent framework suitable for accounting decisively for subalterns. Now, the Romanization of Britain surely focuses on the elites, as we saw in the word cloud before. The elite word was quite big and violent. We couldn't ignore it. Before going back to the book, though, I want to see how this book can be judged elitist by first looking at what Gramsci does with the word elite. Actually, he uses the word dominating groups, gruppi dominanti. We are here in the 25th Prison's Notebook by Gramsci, where he traces a framework for the study of subalterns. Titled At the Margin of History, the notebook defines subalterns as classes that do not own a proper history, but only its fragmented and episodic remains, which is quite crucial in understanding what subalterns are. Who are they? How can we identify them? To be able for Gramsci to put those fragments together again is the mission of what he calls the integral historian. But in order to do that, Gramsci gives considerable space to the study of the elites, the counterpart of subalterns, hinting at the fact that there is no understanding of subalterns if the power relationship between them and the elites is forgotten or worse, ignored. Here, in just a few lines, Gramsci names twice the dominating groups, which shows that to highlight the subalterns, understanding the mechanisms through which the elites perpetuate their power over them is quite crucial. Going back to the romanization of Britain, we can say that it takes off from one powerful sentence, which is, quote, power in society was held by a wealthy elite whose status and economic success were defined by land ownership. So back to the land. But this was not an end in itself, and it continues, quote, but a means to expend vast resources on public display of its prestige and on the maintenance of the client network, which exemplified its power base, end of quote. So the personal growth of individual elites brought to a growth of the elite class as a whole, although not systematically motivated by economic gain as it happens during the modern colonizations. This is a contrast that the romanization of Britain tries to make clear quite often. We're not talking about the same colonizing systems that we saw in the 15th, 16th century and so on during the Roman period. So by looking at the three broad stages that you can see listed here of exploitation of annexed territories, the romanization of Britain stresses the autonomy held by local elites in their administrative role. It maintains that after the Augustan period, reorganization of the provinces limited the excess of provincial exploitation by the elite for their own benefit. Most resources were likely reinvested exactly where the taxes were collected, which is in the cities, which this book particularly refers to the cities as the preserve of native elites. This might have boosted the economic growth and civic development of a provincial rather than imperial level. Provincial growth, of course, was in tune with the interests of the Roman elites, who could do without administering the provincial lands directly, without being directly involved, by simply keeping in contact with local elites. This attitude created, quote, a federation of diverse peoples under Rome, rather than a monolithic, uniformly centralized bloc, end of quote, which again sounds to me quite a post-colonial sentence to hear this way. In fact, the essay by Millet does not start with the Claudian invasion, but makes full use of the material evidence of changes from late pre-Roman Iron Age. These are signified by new settlement patterns, material culture assemblages, particularly with the appearance of wider variety of imports, such as the Dressa-1A amphora, which you can see here, or metalwork, particularly in the southeast of Britain that the previous paper was talking about, and coinage. So one major outcome, I believe, of the romanization of Britain is to link successfully the appearance of signs of elites to inner dynamics connected to trade and political contacts with the Central Gaulish tribes, rather than to Rome's direct intervention. By doing so, it tends to neutralize attempts to reduce the power and coercion relationships happening in Britain to a binary one that equates elites with the colonizers and subalterns with colonized, which is something that a post-colonial framework, in which I firmly believe, tends to make us fall into risk. So the essay, this is something you saw in the previous paper, the essay by Millet investigates the materiality of the past by asking how power within societies was maintained and organized before and after Britain became a Roman province? The answer that the Romanization of Britain gives is centered on symbolism and communication. So one most typical assemblage of late pre-Roman Iron Age material culture, in fact, is the decorated metalwork, likely unsuitable for daily practices like the Battersea Shield from the British Museum you see here, but rather suitable for the elites to symbolize their acquired status and domination over the rest of the groups. Similar interpretations are given for the disposal of the dead, especially in East Yorkshire, where a few war burials are seen by Millet as the result of collective events where the display of grave goods and the inhumed body to the whole community was staged in order to symbolize the dominance of the social elite. A notable symbolic value is given also to the imported drinking vessels, whose monopoly of trade was likely held by the social leaders of the south and the east of Britain until a consistent militarized intervention happened. In fact, the essay does not absolutely ignore the militarized presence of Rome and the role that it played in Britain and other provinces, but it tries to distinguish its disrupting effects from more fluid social contacts that we need to try to unveil and account in the narrative that we do of Roman provinces. In order to do so, it recognizes that although Rome seems to have reinforced the power of the native elite, the 40,000 men in the army, on top of confiscating lands for settlements, brought a very substantial inflow of coinage, amounting to a total of approximately 6.5 million denarii per year. These, of course, are numbers related to a book written in the 1990s, so this can be certainly updated. They must. But these goods, together with the soldiers' pay and requisition food, may have had a destabilizing effect on native society, as they will have devalued the number of commodities, such as wine and vessels to transport it, which had either to been scarce and had fulfilled a role as a prestige commodity, maintaining individuals' powers within their groups. So this dislocation, combined with the disarming of the native elite in 47, was perhaps a major cause of the shift in expressing social position after the conquest. The Romanization of Britain finds also an interesting relationship between the way power was communicated and maintained by local elites in a lack of evidence, such as the paucity of civic building inscriptions, which contrasts with the Mediterranean pattern. These underrepresented evidence is not interpreted here as an absence of wealth, which is obvious in the richness of some villas, for example. But since the abundance of civic building inscriptions is generally considered as a sign for competition between the elite members wanting to emerge or keep the power up, fight each other, their deficiency here is considered a sign of, quote, little need to compete due to the fact that the power was already with their families, end of quote. The essay makes a case for a transformation of the imperial power structures in Britain as the exhibition of Romanitas was transferred from an individual to a collective level. The Romanization of Britain highlights a change of pattern in power relationship in the 1st century AD. Archaeological data from this period show decline of pottery imports counterbalanced by growth of locally produced pottery. Then we have villas. Many more villas in later Roman Britain became the prime places for status display, converted in new residences of the elites. High investment innovations in arable agriculture, such as changes in plows, full crop rotation, and increase in hunting of wild animals, which is seen here as a leisure activity for the elites, so a lot of time available in their rural seats. These four elements lead the author of the book to suggest that the elites established a more individualistic form of wealth display exhibited from the rural seats during the first century. The increasing evidence of the organization of most settlements without villas in the proximities, though, is interpreted as the emergence of a potential egalitarian system with small peasant farmers grouped together in communities, which can explain the majority of villages within Roman Britain. This visible shift in settlement emphasizes a major role, a major social change, perhaps stimulated by the concentration of wealth and land in fewer hands, leaving peasants underclass to develop their new social and settlement forms away from the centers of political authority in a semi-autonomous way. So unlike what highlighted for the early empire, when the elites tend to display their wealth publicly to the benefit of the whole civitas, the later empire seems to show the same wealth indulged on individual private consumption, likely causing a social division and creative reactions to it. The Romanization of Britain in general creates a synthesis of a dynamic paradigm, which is never equal to itself. It is able to track changes in Roman British society through time, focusing on the way the local elites related to their communities through display of wealth and links to the Roman world. The book tends to give precious insights not only on the past, but also on today's society. For example, it is enough to open newspapers today to read about a fracture between the elites and the rest of society, which is generally presented by newspapers as something surprising, new, and unexpected. The last episode during the pandemic, we heard that the virus is not democratic as they used to say at the beginning. The virus was actually amplifying the divide between the rich becoming richer, the poor becoming poorer, not having access to a safe lifestyle, for example. This is actually something that Gramsci was not new to, and believed actually that it was quite a recurrent issue, not only modern, but in ancient society as well. Considering this, I think the Romanization of Britain highlights that the separation between elites and subalterns can be an issue from which surprising new forms of aggregation can derive. The understanding of the steps that brought to a separation between the elites and the subalterns in Roman Britain is a fundamental part of the Romanization of Britain. And I believe that if refiltered through Gramsci's concepts, it can be used as an interpretive tool for the analysis of the materiality of other Roman period regions, as it provides a solid dialectical basis that stages an interaction, a platform for an interaction between elites and subalterns. But I have the feeling that it doesn't really suffocate the space for subalterns and for us to look for signs of their expressions, leaving plenty of room for a strong theorization and the construction of what Gramsci hoped and suggested, which is an integral history of the subalterns. Now, just 1 second before finishing this presentation, I believe there is no better setting and venue to talk about freedom of research than discussing the ideas of a philosopher that spent a lot of his life in prison, exactly because he couldn't exercise freely his ideas. I like to remember usually, but especially in this occasion, my PhD colleague Giulio Regeni, and a student that is nowadays detained in Egypt's prisons, Patrick George Zaki. Both of them in different periods, but for the same reason, for the sake of carrying on a free research, have faced quite extreme consequences. And this was my last thought. Thank you very much.